John Roberts, an ordinary Welsh sailor, sought neither adventure nor fame. He served as a third mate on a merchant vessel transporting slaves when, in 1719, off the coast of Africa, his ship was captured by Howell Davis's pirates. Roberts, a decent and pious man, initially flatly refused to join the outlaws, but fate had other plans. Soon after, Davis died in a skirmish, and the crew, impressed by Roberts's extraordinary intelligence, composure, and determination, unanimously elected him their new captain. Thus was born Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart. He didn't just embrace the pirate life, he elevated it to an absolute, transforming it into a brutal yet absurdly elegant art. Under his command, a fleet of over 470 vessels was captured, and the Atlantic trade routes from the coasts of Brazil to Newfoundland became his personal bloody hunting ground. He introduced a strict code, dressed in silks and velvet, wore diamonds and a gold chain, and played the violin. But beneath this mask of a gentleman lay a ruthless despot. His flamboyant image was merely part of a carefully crafted theatrical display of intimidation, designed to paralyze the will of his victims. He was not a romantic highwayman, but a calculating, ruthless tyrant whose meticulously built empire rested on fear, blood, and absolute power. However, behind this carefully constructed facade of a ruthless tyrant lay a far more complex and grim story of transformation. John Roberts did not wake up one morning a cruel pirate. His descent into the abyss began long before that fateful day in 1719, when his merchant vessel fell into the hands of Howell Davis's pirates off the coast of Africa. He served on a ship carrying human cargo, a slaver. The daily witnessing of dehumanizing cruelty, systematic humiliation, and the absolute lack of rights with which people were treated could not but leave a profound mark on his psyche. This environment, the very fact of his service on such a vessel, even as a third mate, was already the first imperceptible step toward desensitization. He was not an executioner, but he was an integral part of a system that equated humans to cargo. The capture of his ship was not a liberation, but a plunge into a new hell, where rules were dictated by brute force and life hung by a thread. Roberts, a deeply religious man, initially clung desperately to the remnants of his morality, flatly refusing the pirate's trade. But fate, or more precisely, inexorable circumstances, left him no choice. When Howell Davis fell in a skirmish and the crew, as if by instinct, unanimously elected him, John Roberts, as captain, he faced an existential choice. To refuse meant certain death, either at the hands of enraged cutthroats or by the gallows if he were picked up by the authorities. To accept meant to forever break with the past, with his former identity, with the man he once knew as John Roberts. This moment, when he accepted the captain's sash, became that irreversible point of no return. He didn't just take command, he embraced a new, monstrous reality in which survival demanded an extraordinary will to power and an absolute readiness for violence. The pious sailor was killed, and in his place, Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, was born. He had to not merely imitate his predecessors, but to surpass them in cruelty, cold-bloodedness, and strategic thinking to establish and maintain his absolute power over a band of desperate ruffians. His eccentricity, his strict code, his ostentatious luxury, all became part of not just a theater of intimidation, but a meticulously designed system of survival and domination. He was not born a villain, he was forged into one in the crucible of circumstances, where every day became a test of strength and compromise meant certain death. It was in this way, under constant threat and the need to continuously assert his authority, that John Roberts finally transformed into the ruthless and calculating Bart, whose empire rested not only on fear, but also on his own deeply ingrained understanding of human nature, forged in its darkest manifestations. Yet, even the most ruthless tyrant could not have built an empire in a vacuum. The rise of figures like Black Bart was a direct consequence of the global upheaval that shook the world at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries. The era preceding his emergence was a time of fierce wars that redrew the map of Europe, leaving behind not only devastated lands, but also an army of unemployed sailors cast ashore. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession, solidified by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, triggered an unprecedented explosion of piracy. Thousands of former privateers, whose licenses for legal plunder were annulled overnight, found themselves stranded. These men, seasoned by naval battles, accustomed to risk and violence, possessing combat and ship-handling skills, suddenly found themselves without a means of livelihood. Governments, mired in debt and unable to provide for their veterans, effectively abandoned them to their fate. The economic backdrop was equally bleak. Trade routes, especially in the Atlantic, became increasingly busy, filling ships' holds with untold riches, sugar, tobacco, precious metals, slaves. But these riches were concentrated in the hands of a select few, while living and working conditions for ordinary sailors remained intolerable. Low pay, brutal discipline, unsanitary conditions, and the constant threat of disease made service on merchant ships a true hell. For many former naval sailors who had no land or prospects in civilian life, piracy became not just a temptation, but in their view, the only way to survive and gain some semblance of freedom. The social atmosphere of the colonies, especially in the Caribbean and North America, only fueled the fire. Remote and loosely controlled by their metropolises, these territories abounded with secret coves and islands where pirates could resupply, repair ships, and sell their plunder. Corrupt governors and officials often turned a blind eye to their activities and sometimes actively cooperated, profiting from contraband. The Royal Navy, depleted by decades of wars, could not effectively patrol the vast expanses of the ocean, leaving merchant ships defenseless. Thus, on the ruins of the Old World, amidst the chaos of post-war devastation and the indifference of authorities, a new, brutal order flourished where yesterday's sailor could become today's king of the ocean, and law merely a suggestion. It was an era when the state itself, in essence, inadvertently created the ideal environment for the birth of such monsters as Black Bart, and for the unprecedented flourishing of the entire pirate empire. Amidst this chaos and lawlessness, Bartholomew Roberts operated with astonishing speed and calculation, transforming disorder into his personal order. His first truly grand enterprise, demonstrating his strategic genius, occurred off the coast of Newfoundland in June 1720. There, on the Grand Banks, hundreds of fishing vessels gathered, defenseless and trusting, engaged in their trade. Black Bart did not waste time on lengthy sieges or bloody battles. He simply sailed into Trepassey Bay, where most of the fleet was sheltering, and raising his black flag, began methodically seizing one vessel after another. This was not merely robbery, but a demonstration of absolute, overwhelming force. He met no resistance. In a few days, his fleet, consisting of only 2 ships, captured 22 vessels, forcing their crews to join him or abandon their ships. He took everything of value, but his main goal was not so much gold as reputation. He burned part of the fleet to the ground, sending the remains as a warning to the British authorities. The Atlantic waters now belonged to him. This audacious raid immediately made his name legendary among sailors and merchants, spreading fear like an epidemic. But the true masterpiece of his piratical art was the attack on the Portuguese merchant fleet in Bahia, Brazil, in October of that same year, 1720. This was a target most pirates dared not even dream of. 42 Portuguese warships and merchant vessels, laden with treasure, awaiting a convoy to Lisbon. Among them was the flagship, carrying untold riches, gold ingots, diamonds, jewels, and royal regalia. Bart, learning of the fleet's arrival, devised a plan bordering on madness. He did not attack the entire fleet head-on. Instead, using only his 2 ships, he quietly approached the bay under cover of night. At dawn, when the Portuguese ships were still asleep, he sent a small party in longboats to cut the flagship's anchor cables. Panic erupted aboard the flagship. In the confusion, Bart personally led his ships to board. He did not scatter his forces, concentrating on the most valuable prize. The Portuguese, caught off guard, could not offer organized resistance. Their admiral, stunned by the pirates' audacity, chose to flee ashore, abandoning his ship and treasury to their fate. Upon capturing the flagship, Bart discovered treasures that surpassed all his expectations: 100,000 gold coins, vast amounts of gold ingots, 50,000 Portuguese doubloons, diamonds, silks, and ecclesiastical regalia. This was the largest capture in the history of Golden Age piracy. He not only filled his holds, but also sent a daring message to the world. Bartholomew Roberts was not just a robber, but a strategic genius capable of humiliating an entire naval power. He became the living embodiment of a nightmare for merchant fleets and a symbol of absolute, incomprehensible freedom for those who dared to follow him. These grandiose exploits, executed with cold-bloodedness and surgical precision, definitively cemented Black Bart's reputation as not just a lucky pirate, but the most dangerous, ruthless, and calculating strategist of his era. But behind this reputation for genius lay not only luck, but also a masterful command of psychological tactics that transformed the pirate ship into his personal domain and the crew into an obedient instrument. Bart's code was not merely a set of rules, it was a carefully crafted psychological tool. He promised equal shares of the plunder, but mercilessly punished the slightest disobedience, creating a system where fear of the captain was stronger than the desire for mutiny. This was not a democracy, but a rigid hierarchy where his word was law, backed by prodigious will and a readiness for instant violence. His appearance, silk, velvet, a gold chain, and diamonds, was not a whim. It was a costume, carefully tailored for the role of an absolute monarch of the ocean. This flamboyant image, so contrasting with the grimy daily lives of most pirates, created an aura of inaccessibility and power. He didn't just rob, he staged performances. The mere sight of his black flag proudly flying from the mast was enough to make any will to resist evaporate. Rumors of his ruthlessness, reinforced by demonstrative acts of cruelty, burning ships, humiliating captured captains, worked better than any weapon, paralyzing victims even before combat began. This was a meticulously built strategy of psychological superiority, aimed at minimizing risks and maximizing effect. He tolerated no dissent, yet displayed a surprising ability to identify and utilize talents. Bart surrounded himself not just with cutthroats, but with men capable of executing his orders with ruthless precision, turning them into an extension of his own merciless will. He skillfully played on the crew's greed, always reserving the final say in the distribution of plunder, thereby maintaining a delicate balance between motivation and absolute submission. No one dared to dispute his decisions, for the consequences would be swift and lethal. Even his passion for the violin, this paradoxical touch to his portrait, served a purpose. It emphasized his detachment, his otherness, making him even more unpredictable and terrifying. He was not merely a captain, he was an actor on a stage he himself created. John Roberts's transformation into Bartholomew was not accidental. It was a conscious, agonizing rebirth in which he learned to discard morality and embrace ruthlessness as the only means of survival. He quickly absorbed the unwritten laws of the pirate world, surpassing his teachers. His intuition for human weakness, sharpened perhaps even on the slave ship, allowed him to manipulate the fears and desires of both his enemies and his own crew. He was not born a genius, but became one, adapting to the wildest conditions and turning them into his personal domain. This was not just a path to power, but a brutal lesson in adaptation, where survival required not only physical strength, but absolute control over the minds of others. Black Bart's empire, however formidable it seemed, could not exist in absolute isolation. Behind every pirate raid lay a complex network of shadowy patrons and beneficiaries who made his activities possible and even profitable for themselves. Colonial administrations, especially in remote corners of the New World, were permeated by corruption to their very foundation. Governors and high-ranking officials, formally representing the crown, often turned a blind eye to contraband and the trade of stolen goods, and sometimes actively participated, receiving their share of the untold treasures brought in by pirates. Ports like New Providence before its cleanup or remote Caribbean coves served not just as refuges, but as full-fledged logistical centers where pirates could resupply provisions, repair ships, and sell stolen goods, converting them into legitimate currency. Local merchants, eager for quick profit, readily bought goods obtained through violence, ignoring their origin. This symbiotic, albeit criminal, link between the pirate world and colonial elites created a fertile ground in which figures like Bart flourished. But even in this chaos, where law was more the exception than the rule, there were forces that could not forever tolerate the unprecedented scale of piracy. The British Crown, whose trade routes were bleeding under Black Bart's attacks, could not afford a further weakening of its naval hegemony. Every captured ship, every burned port, was not only a blow to the economy, but also a challenge to the empire's very authority. And if at first the Royal Navy, exhausted by prolonged wars, acted slowly and inefficiently, with each new audacious raid by Bart, the authorities' patience wore thin. Finally, a man whose name would become synonymous with relentless retribution stepped onto the scene, Captain Challoner Ogle. He was an officer of a new generation, intolerant of compromise, battle-hardened, and known for his ruthless efficiency. He was given a clear task to capture and destroy Bartholomew Roberts at all costs. Ogle was not a mere bounty hunter, he was the embodiment of state retribution, a representative of the very order that Bart so defiantly scorned and destroyed. Unlike many of his colleagues who preferred to avoid confrontations with the legendary pirate, Ogle was obsessed with ending Black Bart once and for all. He hunted Roberts for months across the Atlantic, his ships, the Swallow and the Worcester, relentlessly scouring the ocean, following hot on the heels of the pirate fleet. This pursuit was not merely the chase of a criminal, it was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies. On one side, a ruthless but charismatic anarchist who defied all established norms, creating his empire on fear and will. On the other, a disciplined, methodical officer representing law, order, and the might of the British Empire. Ogle understood that to defeat an adversary like Bart, it was not enough to simply find him. One had to surpass him in cunning, endurance, and, if necessary, cruelty. He meticulously studied Roberts's tactics, anticipated his next moves, turning every mile of the ocean into a chessboard. Their confrontation became an inevitable final act in a bloody drama, where not only the future of piracy, but the very concept of maritime dominance was at stake. The inevitable clash occurred off the coast of Gabon near Cape Lopez in February 1722. Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps for the first time in his career, allowed himself to underestimate his opponent, mistaking two British warships that appeared on the horizon for another easy prize. He was anchored with his fleet, consisting of 3 vessels, the flagship, Royal Fortune, the Ranger, and the Little Ranger, when Captain Challoner Ogle's Swallow and Worcester appeared on the horizon. Confident in his invincibility, Bart sent the Ranger under James Skierme to intercept. But Skierme encountered not frightened merchants, but a battle-hardened officer who had been tracking his prey for months. Ogle, employing a practiced ruse, ordered his ships to initially retreat, creating an illusion of weakness and luring the Ranger away from the pirates' main force. Then, sharply turning, he unleashed the full might of his guns on the pirate ship. The battle was short and merciless. The Ranger, caught off guard and significantly outmatched in firepower, was quickly defeated. Skyrim and his crew, consisting of over 40 men, were captured. This news was the first truly alarming signal for Bart. He realized that he faced not just another merchant, but a ruthless hunter. The next day, February 13th, Ogle returned, targeting the flagship Royal Fortune. Bartholomew Roberts, dressed in his ceremonial crimson damask waistcoat, diamonds, and gold chain, personally stood on deck, commanding his ship. He had no intention of retreating. His last moments became a true spectacle, worthy of his life. The Royal Fortune and the Swallow closed in. Volley after volley shook the air. The pirates, though desperate, could not match the disciplined training and superior firepower of the Royal Navy. In the midst of the battle, as Bart stood on the quarterdeck, giving orders, grape shot from the Swallow's cannon struck him in the throat. He fell instantly. Death was swift, almost merciful. His crew, stunned by the death of their invincible captain, in the last seconds attempted to conceal his body by throwing it overboard so it would not fall into enemy hands. This was a final act of loyalty and despair. Without its leader, the Royal Fortune quickly surrendered. Over 150 pirates were taken prisoner. Their fate was sealed. Dozens were hanged, many sent to penal servitude. The death of Bartholomew Roberts was not just the end of one man, but a symbol of the final decline of the golden age of piracy. His fall was not an accident, but an inevitable finale. The system he so defiantly scorned and destroyed eventually consumed him. It was a bloody but ultimate triumph of order over chaos, law over lawlessness, and the empire's power over anarchy. The Battle of Cape Lopez marked not only Bart's demise, but also the immediate disbandment of his criminal empire. The ships captured along with the flagship Royal Fortune, and some of the treasures, though much of his colossal fortune had already been dispersed or spent, became trophies of the crown. The exact contents of the Royal Fortune's holds after the battle remain a matter of dispute. However, the captured valuable cargo and the vessels themselves were meticulously inventoried, transported to nearby ports, and ultimately sold at auction. The proceeds went to the British Crown's treasury, partly offsetting the costs of combating maritime piracy. The fate of over 160 prisoners captured from the Royal Fortune and Ranger served as a cautionary tale for all who contemplated a life of piratical freedom. The grand trial, held shortly thereafter in Cape Coast, became the largest in piracy history. Of all the accused, 74 were sentenced to death by hanging, 37 were sent to life servitude on West Indies plantations, and 20 were acquitted. This massive, ruthless, and public justice did not merely punish individual criminals. It sent an unambiguous signal that the era of undisputed pirate dominance had ended. The British Crown, demonstrating its resolve, reasserted its monopoly on violence and justice, affirming its authority over the high seas. Roberts's death and the subsequent cleanup of his fleet's remnants immediately impacted transatlantic trade routes. Trust in maritime trade, undermined by years of pirate depredations, gradually began to recover. Ship owners and merchants, whose investments were constantly at risk of capture, could now expect safer voyages. Although direct compensation for all past losses was naturally not provided, the reduction in risks led to the stabilization of insurance rates and stimulated new trading ventures. This, in turn, contributed to the growth of trade and capital inflow into the colonies, strengthening economic ties between the mother country and the New World. Politically, the victory over Black Bart was a triumph of British naval power. The Royal Navy, having demonstrated its ability to effectively pursue and destroy even the most elusive adversaries, strengthened its authority. The government, emboldened by success, increased funding for anti-piracy operations and reinforced the naval presence in strategically important regions, such as the Caribbean and the West African coast. Piracy laws were revised and tightened, and colonial governors who had often turned a blind eye to smuggling were now under stricter control, their powers in combating sea robbers significantly expanded. New patrol routes were established, coordination between naval bases improved, and the system of issuing privateering commissions, which had so often been a loophole for legalized piracy, was revised and almost entirely abolished. Thus, the fall of Bartholomew Roberts marked a turning point, signaling not only the end of one of the greatest pirates' careers, but also a decisive restoration of order in the Atlantic. It was not merely the end of chaos, but the beginning of a new era, where the British Empire finally solidified its status as the undisputed maritime hegemon, and its trade interests were reliably protected from all threats. However, even as the waves of order washed away the bloody traces of his reign and the British crown asserted its undisputed maritime dominion, a different, far more complex phenomenon began to unfold across the Atlantic. The story of Bartholomew Roberts, a ruthless tyrant and calculating despot, paradoxically transformed into something entirely different. A myth of the last great pirate, a gentleman of fortune whose name became synonymous with freedom and desperate courage. This myth, so enduring to this day, deliberately ignores the inconvenient truth about John Roberts. It extracts his carefully crafted, grotesque theatricality, transforming it into genuine elegance, and his code, designed to suppress will and maintain iron discipline, is interpreted as a code of honor. Society, weary of bureaucracy and rigid social structures, found in the image of Black Bart the ideal anti-hero, a man who dared to defy the system, who lived by his own rules, limitlessly free. And it mattered not that this freedom was paid for with blood and fear, that it rested on monstrous violence and the absolute powerlessness of others. The paradox of his legacy lies precisely in this. A man who embodied the suppression of will became a symbol of its triumph. Bartholomew Roberts built his empire on fear, plunder, and absolute submission, but his posthumous image became a beacon for those who yearned to break free from the shackles of everyday life. His flamboyant appearance, his ostentatious luxury, which served as tools of intimidation during his life, after death transformed into attributes of a romantic hero who did not just rob, but lived large, defying the dull world of respectable burghers. This was convenient, for it is much easier to admire a fictional highwayman than to analyze the true nature of a calculating predator, forged from despair and cynicism. The universal lesson of Bartholomew Roberts' story is how easily human consciousness substitutes complex, inconvenient reality with an appealing but false legend. We want to see heroes and rebels, even if their actions were monstrous. We search in the past for confirmation of our own desires for freedom and independence, even if these desires contradict historical facts. Black Bart's story is a mirror, reflecting not so much his true personality as our own need for myths, for figures capable of embodying our wildest fantasies of a life without limitations. He became what we wanted him to be, not a despot, but a king of anarchy, whose life was an endless adventure, and whose death was a heroic finale, not the inevitable downfall of a tyrant. His legend lives because it offers an escape from routine, a promise of freedom that never existed in his bloody reality.